So for this video, I'm going to be answering questions in the Wishful Thinking Book Tag, and I was kindly tagged by Ola from the channel The Reading Witch, and I loved watching her video and her answering these questions, so I'm very excited to answer these questions as well. There's only 6 questions, but for a lot of these, I might have to go a bit in depth into my reasoning and my explanations for them, so this might end up being actually a longer video than normal. We'll see. But anyway, enough of the preamble. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. So question 1, legacy. Is there an author you wish was still alive today to witness the impact of their work? And honestly, this question is a little bit difficult for me to answer because most of my favorite authors are either alive and still working, or if they are dead, they did live long enough to witness the impact that their work had on the writing community and just culture in general. But for this question, this might be cheating a little bit because Ray Bradbury, who is one of my all-time favorite authors, he obviously lived to see his impact. He wrote probably his most famous story, Fahrenheit 451, in the 50s, and he lived into his 90s. So he was an old man when he died. I think he died probably like 10 or 15 years ago, if I remember correctly. So he obviously witnessed his impact, his huge impact on culture and writing and all of that. But for me, I wish he was still alive so I could talk to him and just tell him how much I love his short stories. He's my all-time favorite short story writer, hands down. Even though I love, Stephen King and George R.R. Martin, they have tons of great short stories. Ray Bradbury is just, he's top-notch when it comes to short stories. And honestly, I wish people would read more Ray Bradbury other than, like his really most famous works like Fahrenheit 451, which a lot of people were probably forced to read in high school, and like The Illustrated Man, which is his most famous collection, and like Something Wicked This Way Comes, the Martian Chronicles. A lot of people have read these or they've heard of them, but he's written dozens of short story collections. And I've read almost all of them, and they're all very good in various different ways. And I wish people would kind of, if they did read Bradbury, but they haven't read more than, like I said, Fahrenheit 451 or some of his more popular ones, and they haven't branched out, I wish people would give him another try and pick up just like a random short story collection just to see how well that Bradbury writes short stories. And the other thing is, Bradbury, like I said, he lived up until he was like in his 90s, and he was still writing until the day he died. So a lot of these published short story collections came out in the 2000s, and which is crazy to think about because, something like Fahrenheit 451 came out in the 50s, which that's a lot of decades to be working, and he just has a vast collection of short stories and novels, and I wish people would give him more of a fair shot. I actually think even though he is widely known, like if you say Ray Bradbury, people know who you're talking about, I still consider him to be pretty underrated. Question 2 is memory wipe. Which book or series do you wish you could forget, either so you could experience it again for the first time or forget completely? Now, I have 2 answers for this. For the experience of reading it for the first time, I would go with, I have the book here, The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, which is the first book in the Stormlight Archive. Now, the first time I read this book, it was just after I finished reading A Song of Ice and Fire, which was sort of my first introduction to adult fantasy. Before that, I had read a lot of Stephen King and Dean Koontz, right, and some thrillers, but I hadn't really dipped my toes into adult fantasy. And of course, starting with the Song of Ice and Fire is a little weird because it's sort of anti-fantasy. It's not your typical fantasy where there's lots of magic and there's lots of the usual tropes. And then so jumping into this, where it is epic fantasy, but it's, having read fantasy now, it is very atypical because the world building in here is so vastly different from most of the fantasy you're going to read. It's super unique. And I remember reading this for the first time and just really getting sucked into the story. Sanderson just transported me right into Roshar, right into the heads of all these characters. And I still remember how I felt just experiencing this story for the first time. And so if I had to wipe my memory clean, I would want to experience this for the first time, because this was one of the rare experiences where, like, Sanderson just transported me to a completely different world, and I was just there for it. And now for the other side, wiping your memory clean to forget it completely, this is going to be a bit of a funnier story. I would want to get rid of my memory of having read 50 Shades of Grey. Now you're probably asking yourself, Jake, why would you read 50 Shades of Grey? Did you think you were going to like it? Did you think it would be good? Did you not know what you were getting into? And the answer to all of those is that I was in a fantasy football league with a lot of my high school friends. We were all in college at the time, and it had been a few years since we first started the league, and we were trying to figure out, well, do we want to play for money? Do we want to, what did we want to do? Because we were kind of, we're broke college students. We didn't want to put down a lot of money on fantasy football. So what we decided to do was that whoever won the league, whoever won the championship, they got to pick a punishment for the person who got in last. And of course, the very first year that we decided to do this, I get last, and all of my friends know that I'm a huge bookworm and that I love to read. So their punishment was to make me read 50 Shades of Grey. And I read it, and I wish I hadn't. And quite frankly, I wish, if there's any book that I could wipe my memory of, it's that book. Because it was really bad. I went into it, I was like, you know what? It's not going to be a good book, but can it really be as bad as people make it out to be? And yeah, it was. It was very bad. And question number 3 is Destiny. Which character do you wish had a different fate? Now, this is an interesting question too, because even though a lot of books, have character deaths that you don't typically, they could be like your favorite characters and you don't want them to die. But on the other hand, if it makes sense for the story and it's compelling and you get a reaction out of it, an emotional reaction out of it, then I wouldn't want to change it. So I had a hard time coming up with an answer for this. But the one that I will talk about here is The Only Good Indians. And I'll put down a spoiler banner here because in order to talk about this, I have to spoil the book. So, spoilers for anyone who has not read this book yet. I don't know if I'll put a countdown here or something. I don't know. So we get introduced to the main character of Lewis, and Lewis is a very interesting character, and from hearing a lot of people's reactions to this book and discussions of this book, I had a hard time with it at the start, and they couldn't really get into They didn't get attached to Lewis right away. But for me, I almost instantly gravitated towards him because we had a lot in common. I'm talking about him like he's a real person, but you know what I mean. Lewis, he works for the post office. I work for the post office. He loves basketball. I love basketball. And then there were a lot of like little things in the book that I picked up on that I kind of connected to, and I kind of felt a kindred spirit with him. So I was, we're reading this book and we're getting basically the whole book through his perspective. And then not even halfway through the book, maybe like 45% through the book, craziness ensues and he ends up dying. And I'm just like, but who are we going to get the perspective from now? And, and then the book goes on from there and it's really good. Like, it's a 4.5-star book. But I kind of wanted more from Lewis because I was loving getting the story from his perspective. So if I did have to change a fate of a character, I would have tried to tell the story or get more screen time with Lewis because I was really enjoying his perspective. So that was probably a long explanation, but yeah, I really loved Lewis in this book, and then his death was very shocking, and it makes sense for the story, and then from there you kind of get various perspectives throughout, but it wasn't quite as good as it was told from Lewis's perspective. So that's something that I would probably change, even though it really wouldn't make that much sense. Oh well. Question 4, namesake. If a character was going to be named after you, what kind of person would you wish them to be, or what sort of story would you want them to be in? Now, if I was a character in a story, what I would want is for it to be an epic fantasy series where the magic system is based on musical ability and just music in general. I don't know if this already exists or not, but it would be a cool idea for a story, in my opinion. So basically, kind of like how Mistborn, you get different powers through different metals. In this world, whatever this world would look like, you can use music as sort of a way to cast spells. So if someone's really good with like the saxophone, there's different spells you can use for the saxophone, or even your voice. You can sing, and that's a way to cast a spell. So obviously, for me being a drummer, I would be sort of the drum wizard or drum guru, or however you want to go about saying that. And obviously, different rhythms, right, would cast different spells, and I would be able to gain abilities through, playing different drum patterns. So that would be pretty fun. And I actually thought about attempting to write a story based on like having like drumming be like a different magic system. I think I tried to do that a couple years ago, and it didn't really take off. But yeah, if that would ever happen, or if someone published that, I would read that in a heartbeat. That would be very cool. Question number 5, collectibles. Which fictional object do you wish you could own? And this is going to be really cheating, but there's a story or a novel written by George R.R. Martin from the 80s called Tough Voyaging. And in this book, it's kind of a short story collection, but it's also kind of like a fix-up novel where he took a bunch of stories with the main character, Haviland Tough, and sort of wove it and created a narrative out of it. And in the first story, in the first chapter, basically, Haviland Tough gets his hands on this huge, giant ecological ship that has the ability to manipulate and change ecosystems on planets. And I think that would be a very cool thing to own, even though that's kind of stretching it. That's not an object. That's literally like a giant ass spaceship. But, it would be very cool because, the rest of the book is basically him going to different planets and affecting their ecosystems in various ways, either for good or for bad. And I think it would be very cool to own because maybe I could take that and change some things here on Earth. Maybe for the good, maybe for the... No. It would be for the good. But yeah, I think that would be an interesting thing to own. Also, this is just a plug for this book. It's vastly underrated sci-fi here. George R.R. Martin, for those who don't know, wrote a bunch of books and collections in the 70s and 80s, and this is one of his best. It's an interesting book because, Song of Ice and Fire is known for being very dark and just very brooding fantasy, very realistic and oftentimes nihilistic. But this book, written by George R.R. Martin, is written more in a playful tone, and there's a lot of comedy in here, and it sort of has more of a light atmosphere, and Haviland Tuff is a very interesting George R.R. Martin character, and I think people would be very surprised to read this book and realize that this was the same guy who wrote, A Song of Ice and Fire, which is very dark. And I think people should try this out, especially if they're really into older sci-fi. Now, this isn't like Asimov or Heinlein or anything, but, it's from the 80s, and I think a lot of people who appreciate older sci-fi would get a kick out of this one. And the last question here, question 6, reset button. Which book or series do you wish was written by a different author? Now, for me, this is going to be a very unpopular opinion, but I'm going to go ahead and go with the original Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. And honestly, the Mistborn trilogy is one of the most, maybe not the most, but it's fairly overrated in my opinion. And this is coming from a guy who loves Brandon Sanderson. He's my third favorite author. I love Stormlight Archive. I love a lot of the stuff that's in the Cosmere. And to be fair, The Final Empire, the first book, is great. The second book, Well of Ascension, is fine. And then really Hero of Ages is just very overrated. It's my least favorite Cosmere book by a mile. So if I were to take a series and have it written by a different author, I think it would be very interesting to see what Scott Lynch would do with the Mistborn trilogy. And for anyone who doesn't know, Scott Lynch wrote The Lies of Locke Lamora, which is the first book in the Gentleman Bastard series. That's one of my all-time favorite series. And really, those two books, Lies of Locke Lamora and The Final Empire, are very similar because it involves a gang of thieves attempting to throw a heist and to steal something. And I think Scott Lynch writing the Mistborn trilogy, I think, would be very entertaining. First of all, Scott Lynch would bring a lot better and just more humor to the Mistborn trilogy in general. Now, I love Sanderson, but one of his weakest qualities is his humor. He can sometimes be very funny, but oftentimes it's very hit or miss. A lot of the jokes just fall flat for me. But Scott Lynch, man, is just hilarious. And anyone who's read Lies of Locke Lamora knows what I'm talking about. So he would really bring out the humor and the dark humor. And just in general, I think the side characters would improve a lot. Because in the Gentleman Bastard series, you get a lot of different characters that weave in and out of the story, and they're all great. But in this one, really the main characters that I care about are Vin and Kelsier. Everyone else is just very bland and forgettable, which, don't shoot me, but that's just my opinion. So I think Scott Lynch would take these characters and really bring them to life, and I think he would do a much better job. And also Brandon Sanderson writing about like dark subject matter and like having this setting be a very dark and gloomy setting, I think really doesn't fit his style very well. Like, this series in a lot of ways could have ended up being a very grim, dark series. So I think Scott Lynch would be able to, what's the word? Accentuate. Is that a word? He would bring out the darker qualities in a much better way, I think. Where Sanderson, even though he is writing about, a series where, that you got this evil overlord basically reigning over these people for 1,000 years and ashes falling from the sky, it still doesn't feel very dark. It doesn't feel dark enough for me. So Scott Lynch writing this, I think, would do a much better job. And also Sanderson writing about the magic system in here. The magic system is very cool, don't get me wrong, but a lot of the times it feels like I need like a pamphlet just to make sure that I remember like all of the different magic systems and just which metal does which ability. A lot of the times it doesn't even feel like magic to me. It feels like a science textbook. So I think Scott Lynch tackling this, I think he would sort of maybe break the fourth wall a little bit, and the characters inside the story would get confused as well, and that would make me feel a lot better. Like some of the characters would be like, have this metal do that, and then they're like, no, this metal does that, and then they're like, wait, what does that do again? So I think that would be a way that Scott Lynch would bring more humor to the story. And overall, I think he would, just in general, Scott Lynch tackling the Mistborn trilogy, I would read that. I would want to read that way more than the original Mistborn trilogy as it's written now. Even though the first book is good, books 2 and 3 are just very meh for me. So Scott Lynch writing the original Mistborn trilogy would be awesome. All right, so those are all of the questions for the Wishful Thinking Book Tag. Thank you again, Ola from The Reading Witch, for tagging me in this video, or in your video, I should say. I'm not really sure who to tag for this video. I'm just going to put it out there that if you're watching this video and you do feel like making your own tag video for this, consider yourself tagged. Also, let me know down in the comments below what you thought of my answers for this tag. And yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching and have a terrific day.